The clock on my study wall chimed exactly 11:30 at night. The rain was coming down hard in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, beating violently against the thick glass windows of my home. It was the kind of torrential downpour that seemed to wash all the color out of the world, leaving only dark shadows and the endless, rhythmic drum of water against the roof. I am Ronald Vance. I am 58 years old, and I spent my entire life building an industrial salvage and scrap metal empire from nothing but rust, sweat, and raw steel. People look at me now and see a quiet, retired widower who tends to his garden, reads old history books, and drinks his evening bourbon in peace. They see a harmless old man who is slowly fading into the background of a quiet suburban life. They do not see the man who survived 30 years in the cutthroat steel and salvage industry. They do not see the scars on my hands or the cold, calculating mind that knows exactly how to tear down a massive structure piece by piece without letting a single beam fall out of place. I had just poured myself a generous glass of bourbon, the good stuff I save for special occasions, when my burner phone buzzed against the dark mahogany desk. It vibrated heavily, a harsh, low sound that cut through the noise of the storm. Very few people have that number. In fact, only two people in the world knew how to reach me on this specific line. One of them is Arthur Morales, a 65-year-old military veteran who has managed my properties and warehouses with absolute loyalty and ironclad discipline for 2 decades. I picked it up on the second ring. Arthur did not bother with greetings or pleasantries. His voice was a harsh, raspy whisper barely rising above the sound of the torrential rain on his end. "Mr. Vance, it is happening. Julian is at gate 4. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, feeling the familiar, warm burn of the alcohol slide down my throat, grounding me in the moment. "Is he alone, Arthur?" "No, sir," Arthur replied, his breath hitching slightly, the wind howling through his microphone. "He has heavy iron bolt cutters, and he brought company. 2 large men. They are armed. I can see the glint of handguns tucked into their waistbands." "What are your orders? Do I engage? Do I trigger the silent alarms?" I stood up from my leather chair and walked over to my desk. I picked up my iPad, my fingers tapping the screen to bring up the hidden high-definition surveillance feed I had secretly installed weeks ago. The screen flickered to life, cutting through the darkness with crisp night vision. There he was, my son-in-law, Julian Thorne, the self-proclaimed venture capitalist, the man who wore suits that cost more than my first truck, standing in the freezing mud of the industrial district, gripping a pair of heavy iron bolt cutters. I watched the rain plaster his perfectly styled hair to his forehead. I saw the desperate, greedy twitch in his jaw, the erratic way his eyes darted from the lock to the dark alleyway behind him. He looked like a cornered animal, but one that still believed it was the predator. "No, Arthur," I said, my voice dead calm. "Do not engage. Do not call the local police. I want you to pull all the perimeter guards back, open the outer blind spots, give him a clear path to the main loading dock." Arthur hesitated for only a fraction of a second. He was a man who had faced combat, and he knew how to follow orders, even when they seemed to defy common sense. He knew me too well to question my sanity. "Are you absolutely sure, sir? Those men with him look like serious trouble. They are not local kids looking for copper. They look like professional enforcers." "I am entirely sure," I replied, resting my hand on a framed photograph of my late wife, Clara, which sat in the center of my desk. "Let him cut the lock, Arthur. Let him walk right in. Tonight he digs his own grave, and I want to watch him jump inside." I hung up the phone and set it down. On the screen, Julian was struggling with the heavy chain securing the outer chain link fence of Depot 42. He looked pathetic, a rat trying to gnaw its way into a steel trap. He had no idea what was waiting for him from inside that rusted, dilapidated warehouse. He thought he was about to secure his financial freedom. He thought he had outsmarted a clueless old boomer who did not know the value of his own holdings. As I watched him finally snap the first lock, a cold, hard knot of anger tightened in my chest. To understand how we ended up here with my daughter's husband, committing a major felony in the dead of night, you have to go back exactly 3 months. You have to go back to the exact moment the seed of doubt was planted. The moment I realized a parasite had attached itself to my family. It was Chloe and Julian's second wedding anniversary. Chloe is my 32-year-old daughter. She is the light of my life, a sweet, trusting soul who runs her own boutique floral design shop. When Clara passed away, I made a silent vow at her graveside that I would protect our daughter from everything, from heartbreak, from failure, and most importantly, from greedy men who prey on kindness. Chloe had organized a celebratory dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown. I arrived early, wearing a simple but clean suit, happy just to see my daughter smile. Julian arrived 15 minutes late, loudly complaining to the valet about the parking, flashing his expensive watch, and acting like he owned the entire restaurant. He always rubbed me the wrong way. He talked too fast, promised too much, and always seemed to be looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important had walked into the room. We were halfway through our ribeyes when the conversation took a very strange turn. Chloe was talking about a new flower supplier she had found, but Julian was completely distracted. He kept tapping his fork against his water glass, his eyes darting toward me. "So, Ronald," Julian said casually, leaning back in his chair and swirling his red wine. "I was driving through the industrial park the other day looking at some commercial real estate for a tech startup I am funding. I happened to pass by one of your old properties, Depot 42, I think it is called." I stopped chewing. I placed my fork down very slowly. I did not react outwardly, but internally every single alarm bell I possessed began to ring. I have never discussed my business assets with Julian. I have never mentioned Depot 42 to anyone, not even to Chloe. It was an old, rusted facility sitting on a neglected patch of land. There was absolutely no reason for a venture capitalist to be driving through that specific rundown area, let alone pulling property records to know it belonged to me. "Is that so?" I asked, maintaining a perfectly neutral, slightly confused expression. "Just an old holding property, nothing but dust and rusted pipes." "Why do you ask?" Julian smiled. It was a slick, practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just curious," he said. "It seems like prime real estate if you clear the junk out. A massive footprint, you know? Holding on to dead weight like that is bad business, Ronald. Taxes, liabilities. Have you ever thought about liquidating it? I have some developers who would pay top dollar just for the land." I looked at my daughter. Chloe was blissfully unaware of the tension, sipping her champagne and smiling at her husband. She thought he was just being helpful. She thought he was the successful, wealthy investor he claimed to be. But my gut, the instinct honed by decades of dealing with scrap metal thieves, corrupt contractors, and greedy businessmen, told me otherwise. Why would a man who supposedly manages tens of millions in venture capital care about an abandoned warehouse in the Rust Belt? Why was he digging into my private holdings? And why, despite his expensive suits, did his eyes look so desperately hungry? I picked up my napkin and wiped my mouth. I let a slow, harmless, grandfatherly smile spread across my face. The kind of smile that makes a predator think his prey is completely blind, weak, and ready to be taken. "Well, Julian," I said, keeping my voice light and slightly raspy, "I am just a retired old man. Real estate markets and developer portfolios are a bit over my head these days. I just let it sit there. It is not hurting anyone. It is just a memory of the old days." I saw a brief, sharp flash of satisfaction in Julian's eyes. He thought I was weak. He thought I was ignorant. He thought he had just found a gold mine guarded by a senile old fool who was too tired to care. But as I sat there in the restaurant matching his fake smile with my own, I knew one thing for certain. My daughter was married to a fraud. I did not know what his angle was yet, or how deep his lies went. But I was going to find out. I was going to tear his entire facade apart, piece by piece, until the ugly truth was exposed for Chloe to see. I paid the bill that night without batting an eye. When the waiter brought the leather folder, Julian did not even make the polite, customary gesture of reaching for his wallet. He simply leaned back, patted his stomach, and praised the quality of the Wagyu beef, acting as if his presence alone was payment enough. I handed over my credit card with a warm smile, playing the role of the generous, satisfied father perfectly. But beneath the table, my hands were clenched into tight fists, my knuckles, permanently scarred from decades of pulling jagged steel apart, throbbed with a dull ache. The ride home was quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Pittsburgh slick and reflective under the amber glow of the streetlights. Driving my old reliable truck through the city, my mind drifted back to the early days. It is funny how people like Julian look at me now. They see an old man in a flannel shirt and assume my life was as simple as my wardrobe. They have no idea what it took to build a salvage empire from absolute zero. When Clara and I first married, we had nothing but a rusted pickup truck, a box of basic tools, and a mountain of debt. I spent 14 hours a day in the salvage yards. I breathed in the smell of burning copper, diesel fuel, and damp earth until it seeped into my very pores. I tore apart condemned factories, stripped copper wiring from abandoned mills, and hauled scrap iron until my back felt like it was breaking in two. I did it all for them. Clara would come down to the yard at 7 in the evening, carrying a thermos of black coffee and 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil. We would sit on the tailgate of that old truck covered in grime and talk about the future we were building for Chloe. I promised Clara on her deathbed that I would never let anyone take what we had built for our little girl. I intended to keep that promise. Men like Julian Thorne despise the dirt. They recoil at the smell of sweat and grease. Yet they are the first to show up with their manicured hands extended, desperate to claim the money that the dirt produced. He thought I was just an old fool, hoarding useless industrial lots. He did not realize that in my line of work, you learn how to spot a piece of worthless scrap disguised as something shiny. I barely slept that night. I sat in my study, the only room in my house that still smells faintly of the old salvage days, and stared at the dark oak walls. Why did he ask about that specific warehouse? The holding company that owns it is buried under layers of legal protection. Someone would have to be actively hunting for my assets to trace that property back to me. He must have hired someone, or spent hours digging through registry records. The answer came knocking on my front door the very next morning at exactly 9. I was in the kitchen brewing a pot of dark roast coffee when the doorbell chimed. When I opened the door, I found Julian standing on the porch. He was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit and holding an expensive leather briefcase. Chloe was standing right beside him, holding his arm, looking up at him with a gaze so full of blind admiration it made my stomach turn. "Good morning, Ronald," Julian said, flashing that identical bright empty smile from the restaurant. "I hope we are not interrupting your morning routine." I wiped my hands on a dish towel and ushered them inside. "Not at all," I said, keeping my voice gentle and welcoming. "I was just making coffee." "What brings you two out so early on a Saturday?" Chloe kissed my cheek. "Julian was up half the night working, Dad," she said, her voice brimming with pride. "He wanted to show you something important. He is so dedicated to helping us organize our family investments." I led them into the living room and offered them a seat. Julian unzipped his briefcase with practiced efficiency. He pulled out a thick, glossy financial portfolio bound in a professional folder and slid it across the coffee table toward me. It looked like the kind of presentation you give to a board of directors, not your retired father-in-law on a Saturday morning. "Ronald, I know we briefly touched on this last night," Julian began, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees to appear earnest and sincere. "But I could not stop thinking about your portfolio. I did some deep diving into the county property records. I hope you do not mind. I just want to look out for the family." I picked up the folder. The first page showed an aerial map of the industrial district with my property, Depot 42, outlined in bright red ink. Next to it was a breakdown of estimated property taxes and maintenance liabilities. "You are bleeding money on a dead asset, Ronald," Julian continued, his voice dropping into a tone of faux concern. "That warehouse is sitting on prime commercial land, but the structure itself is a liability. You are paying commercial taxes on an empty shell. As a venture capitalist, it hurts me to see capital tied up like that. You are 58 years old. You should be enjoying your years, not paying taxes on rusted metal." I flipped through the pages slowly, pretending to be overwhelmed by the numbers and the pie charts. He had done his homework, I will give him that. But his math was entirely based on public tax records. He had no idea what was actually going on behind those rusted doors. "I have developers in my network right now," Julian said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that bordered on predatory. "They are looking for industrial footprints in that exact zip code. I can broker a private sale. I can get that dead weight off your hands by the end of the month and put a massive liquid cash injection directly into your retirement account. You would not have to lift a finger. I will handle all the paperwork." I looked over at Chloe. She squeezed his hand, nodding eagerly. "Dad, you have to admit he is making total sense," she said softly. You have worked so hard your entire life. You do not need the stress of managing abandoned properties. Julian is a financial genius. He knows exactly how to handle these corporate sales. Let him help you. The rage flared up inside me again, hot and sharp. My sweet, trusting daughter was sitting in my living room, actively helping a parasite try to drain my assets. He had completely brainwashed her. He had convinced her that he was our financial savior, a wealthy expert gracing us with his brilliant business acumen. I wanted to grab him by the collar of his tailored suit and throw him out onto the street. I wanted to demand exactly how much debt he was hiding behind those expensive clothes. Instead, I forced my shoulders to drop. I let out a long, heavy sigh, acting exactly like the tired, confused old man he needed me to be. "Well, Julian," I said, tapping my calloused finger against his glossy report, "this is an awful lot to take in. I am just not used to moving this fast. My accountant usually handles these tax forms, and I am not too great with all this modern financial jargon." Julian smiled, a look of distinct triumph flashing across his face. "You do not have to understand all the jargon, Ronald. That is what I am here for. I can draw up the power of attorney documents this afternoon. Just a limited proxy so I can negotiate with the buyers on your behalf." I shook my head slowly, handing the folder back to him. "I appreciate the hard work, son. I really do, but I am old-fashioned. I never sign anything the same day I read it. Leave the proposal with me. Let me read through it this week with a magnifying glass and a cup of tea. We can talk about it again next weekend." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened. The impatience leaked out just enough for me to catch it. He needed that money fast. The urgency was palpable. "Of course, Ronald," he recovered quickly, packing the documents away. "Take your time. Just know that real estate markets fluctuate. These buyers will not wait around forever." As I walked them to the door, I noticed Julian pause by the entrance to my private study. His eyes darted past the open door, landing squarely on the heavy vintage steel safe bolted to the corner of the room. He stared at it for only 2 seconds, but 2 seconds was all I needed to confirm my suspicions. He was not just going to wait for me to sign his papers. He was looking for another way in. The hunt had officially begun, and I was more than ready to play the game. The morning sun crawled across the hardwood floors of my study, illuminating the heavy steel door of my vintage safe. I had been sitting in my leather armchair since dawn, staring at that combination dial, replaying the hungry look in Julian's eyes from the night before. Men like him cannot hide their greed. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The house was completely silent, exactly the way Claire and I used to enjoy our Sunday mornings. I was just about to head out to the garden to clear my head when the sharp chime of the front doorbell shattered the quiet. I glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was barely 8. Nobody drops by unannounced at this hour unless there is an emergency or they are selling something. I tightened my robe and walked to the foyer. Looking through the peephole, I saw my daughter Chloe and her husband standing on the porch. Julian looked like he had just stepped out of a financial magazine. Wearing a crisp, tailored suit, despite it being a Sunday morning, he was clutching a thick, leather-bound portfolio tightly against his chest. Chloe looked tired, holding a card tray of coffees, but she wore a strained smile. I unlocked the heavy door and pulled it open, pasting a look of pleasant surprise onto my face. "Chloe, sweetheart, what a surprise!" I stepped aside to let them in. "You should have called. I would have put some breakfast together." "We brought pastries, Dad," Chloe said, kissing my cheek as she walked past me into the kitchen. "We know it is early, but Julian was up practically all night working on something for you. He was so excited he could not even wait for Monday." I turned to look at Julian. He stood in my foyer, radiating a false energetic warmth. "Good morning, Ronald," he said, extending his hand. "I am sorry for the ambush, but when an opportunity strikes, you have to grab it." I shook his soft, manicured hand, feeling the stark contrast against my own calloused palms. I led them into the living room, gesturing toward the sofa. Julian sat down, placing his leather portfolio on the coffee table with a heavy thud. He unzipped it with practiced efficiency, pulling out a stack of high-gloss, professionally bound documents. He spread them out across the glass surface. I sat across from him, resting my hands on my knees, playing the part of the confused, aging father perfectly. "Ronald, I know we briefly touched on this at dinner last night. Julian began, leaning forward to appear earnest and sincere. But I could not stop thinking about your holding properties. I did a deep dive into the county tax records. I hope you do not mind. I just want to look out for the family's future. I picked up the first folder. The cover page showed an aerial map of the industrial district with Depot 42 outlined in bright red. Next to it was a detailed breakdown of estimated property taxes, maintenance liabilities, and projected losses. You are bleeding money on a dead asset, Ronald. Julian continued, his voice dropping into a tone of deep, artificial concern. That warehouse is sitting on prime commercial land, but the structure itself is a massive liability. You are paying high commercial taxes on an empty shell. As a venture capitalist, it physically hurts me to see capital tied up like that. You are 58 years old. You should be enjoying your retirement, traveling, relaxing, not paying taxes on rusted metal and contaminated soil. I flipped through the pages slowly, pretending to be overwhelmed by the numbers and the colorful pie charts. He had certainly done his homework, but his math was entirely based on public tax records. He had absolutely no idea what was actually going on behind those rusted doors. I have developers in my private network right now, Julian said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that bordered on predatory. They are looking for industrial footprints in that exact zip code. I can broker a private sale. I can get that dead weight off your hands by the end of the month and put a massive liquid cash injection directly into your retirement account. You would not have to lift a single finger. I will handle all the paperwork, the lawyers, the negotiations, everything. Chloe walked into the living room, setting down a tray with the coffees and pastries. She sat next to Julian, wrapping her arm around his and looking at me with an expression that made my stomach turn. Dad, you have to admit he is making total sense, Chloe said softly, though there was a distinct edge to her voice. You have worked so hard your entire life. You do not need the stress of managing abandoned properties. You are not a young man anymore. Julian is a financial genius. He knows exactly how to handle these corporate sales. Let him help you. The passive-aggressive sting of her words hit me hard. She was looking at me like I was a relic, an old pack rat clinging to trash. You need to let go of the past, Dad, she continued, her tone patronizing. Those scrapyards, those dirty old warehouses, they belong to a different lifetime. You promised Mom you would take care of yourself. Let Julian handle this. It is what he does best. The rage flared up inside me again, hot and sharp. My sweet, trusting daughter was sitting in my living room, actively helping a parasite try to drain my assets. He had completely brainwashed her. He had convinced her that he was our financial savior, a wealthy expert gracing us with his brilliant business acumen. I wanted to grab him by the collar of his tailored suit and throw him out onto the street. I wanted to demand exactly how much debt he was hiding behind those expensive clothes, but I forced my shoulders to drop. I let out a long, heavy sigh, acting exactly like the tired, confused old man he needed me to be. Well, Julian, this is an awful lot to take in, I said, tapping my finger against his glossy report. I am just not used to moving this fast. My accountant usually handles these tax forms, and I am not too great with all this modern financial jargon. Julian smiled, a look of distinct triumph flashing across his face. You do not have to understand all the jargon, Ronald. That is what I am here for. I can draw up the limited proxy documents this afternoon, just a signature so I can negotiate with the buyers on your behalf. I shook my head slowly, gathering the folders. I appreciate the hard work, son. I really do, but I never sign anything the same day I read it. Leave the proposal with me. Let me read through it. Julian's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his fake smile plastered on. Of course, Ronald. Take your time, Julian said. Just remember, these buyers will not wait forever. The market is moving fast, I understand. I watched through the front window as Julian guided Chloe down the porch steps. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that probably looked like loving devotion to anyone else. But to me, it looked exactly like a handler steering his mark. They climbed into his leased sports car, a vehicle I now suspected he could not actually afford, and pulled out of the driveway. The sound of the engine faded down the quiet suburban street, leaving me alone with the heavy, stifling silence of the empty house. I stood there for a long time, feeling a cold, bitter wave of disrespect wash over me. It was not just the arrogance of his financial presentation or the slick, practiced way he tried to manipulate me into signing away a property I had bled for. It was the sheer audacity of coming into my home, eating the pastries my daughter bought, and looking at me as if I were nothing more than a decaying obstacle standing between him and a payday. He looked at me the way a vulture looks at a dying animal. I walked slowly back into the living room and picked up the glossy financial portfolio he had left on the coffee table. I tossed it into the trash can without a second thought. I did not need to read his fabricated numbers. I already knew exactly what he was trying to do. I made my way down the hallway to my private study, the room Julian had been eyeing just moments before. I closed the door behind me and walked over to the vintage steel safe, bolted to the corner of the floor. It was a massive, heavy piece of iron manufactured back in the 1950s. The combination dial was worn smooth from decades of use. I ran my calloused hand over the cold metal, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of it. This safe was a symbol of everything Clara and I had built. When we started the salvage business, we could not afford a proper banking setup. We kept our first earnings completely in cash, locked inside a small metal lockbox hidden under our bed. As the business grew, so did the risks. I bought this safe after our first major contract, a demolition job that took 6 months to complete. I promised Clara on the day we bolted it to the floor that I would always fill it with enough security to make sure Chloe would never have to struggle the way we did. Clara was a fierce, perceptive woman. She could spot a liar from a mile away. If she were still here, she would have seen right through Julian's expensive suits and hollow charm on the very first day Chloe brought him home for dinner. But Clara was gone, and the responsibility to protect our daughter fell entirely on my shoulders. I looked at the framed photograph of Clara sitting on my desk. Her warm, knowing eyes seemed to pierce right through the glass. I will not let him break you, Chloe. I will not let him take a single dime of what we built. But I knew I had to be smart. If I simply called Chloe and told her that her husband was a scheming gold digger, she would defend him. Julian had spent 2 years building a narrative painting himself as the successful, caring partner. If I attacked him directly, I would become the villain. I would be the paranoid, controlling father trying to ruin her marriage. Julian would use my accusations to drive a wedge between us, isolating Chloe and making her even more dependent on him. I could not allow that to happen. I had to let Julian think he was winning. I had to let him believe his manipulation was working, that the clueless old man was slowly taking the bait. I needed to feed his greed until he became reckless enough to expose his true nature right in front of Chloe. I picked up my phone and dialed Arthur Morales. The line rang twice before his gruff voice answered. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," Arthur said. "Do we have a problem at the yard today?" "Not at the yard, Arthur," I replied, sinking into my leather desk chair. "I need you to do something for me, and I need it done quietly. I want you to pull the original leasing deeds for Depot 42. Make high-quality copies of the cover pages, the ones showing my name as the sole proprietor and the tax assessment values, but redact the leasing agreement with the Federal Transport Company. I do not want any mention of the armored vehicles or the security protocols. Make it look like a standard inactive holding property." Arthur was silent for a moment. He was a smart man, a former military logistics officer who never asked unnecessary questions unless he sensed danger. "Are we preparing for a sale, sir?" "No," I said, my voice hardening. "We are preparing a trap. I have a rat sniffing around the perimeter, and I need to lay out some cheese. Put the redacted copies in a standard manila folder and have one of the trusted drivers drop it off at my house this afternoon." "Understood, sir. It will be there by 3. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair, staring at the heavy steel safe. Julian wanted access to my holdings. He wanted to review the deeds. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, but on my terms. I would invite him over next week under the guise of discussing his proposal. I would hand him the redacted deeds, letting him think he was one step closer to getting my signature. I would play the hesitant but agreeable father-in-law, asking naive questions about venture capital and real estate markets. But I knew Julian. Men driven by sudden, desperate greed do not have the patience for slow negotiations. His lingering look at my safe told me everything I needed to know. He was evaluating the security of my home. He was wondering what else I kept locked away. If he was willing to manipulate my daughter to steal a warehouse, he was certainly willing to break into my private study to find leverage or cash. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the meticulously manicured lawn. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with families enjoying their peaceful Sunday morning. They had no idea that a quiet war was brewing inside the walls of my home. I needed to prepare the battlefield. I spent the next 2 hours securing the study. I went online and ordered 3 high-definition, motion-activated hidden cameras. I chose models designed to look like ordinary objects: a digital clock, a smoke detector, and a charging brick. I paid for expedited shipping, ensuring they would arrive by Tuesday. I planned to position them to cover every angle of the room, with a direct line of sight focusing squarely on the vintage safe. Next, I decided to modify the safe itself. It contained important documents, family heirlooms, and a significant amount of emergency cash. I could not leave those assets vulnerable to a desperate thief. On Monday morning, I drove down to the Pittsburgh Federal Bank, carrying a heavy leather duffel bag. Inside the bag was everything of real value that had been stored in my study safe. The original deeds to all my salvage yards, the bearer bonds I had collected over the years, Clara's diamond engagement ring, and Chloe's childhood drawings that Clara had kept in a velvet box. I transferred all of it to a secure safety deposit box, leaving the safe in my study completely empty of any genuine assets. I then returned home and began preparing the decoy. I used several stacks of single-dollar bills, wrapping them in tight bands with $100 bills on the outside. From a distance, it looked like several tens of thousands of dollars in cash. But the real bait was the document. I sat at my computer and designed a highly convincing, official-looking inventory manifest on my old Vance Industrial Salvage letterhead. I detailed a fictional shipment of 150 industrial platinum bars, valued at approximately $15 million, currently stored in Cargo Container 12 at Depot 42. I added details about a private unregistered customs bond and noted that the shipment was scheduled for a quiet liquidation sale to a foreign buyer on Saturday morning. I folded the document and placed it right on top of the decoy cash inside the safe. I closed the heavy steel door, turning the dial just enough to set the lock but leaving the tumblers aligned so that a single turn of the dial would release the bolt. If Julian attempted to open it, he would not need to spend hours trying to crack the code. He would only need to give the dial a slight nudge, and the door would swing open. I wanted him to succeed. I wanted him to feel the thrill of discovering what he believed was a hidden fortune. I let 2 full weeks pass without giving Julian a single update. I ignored his subtle text messages, dodged his casual phone calls, and maintained the perfect illusion of an old man dragging his feet. I knew his creditors were squeezing him, and every day he delayed was another day closer to his ruin. That crack finally appeared on a crisp Tuesday morning, right in front of my daughter's flower shop. Chloe owned a beautiful little boutique in the historic district. It poured her heart, her soul, and every ounce of her savings into that place. It always smelled of fresh eucalyptus, damp potting soil, and blooming lilies. I decided to drop by unannounced, bringing her favorite cinnamon scones from the bakery down the street. I parked my truck a block away and walked toward her storefront, enjoying the brisk morning air. But as I rounded the corner, the picturesque scene of her charming boutique was shattered by the harsh grinding sound of heavy diesel machinery. A massive, battered tow truck was backed aggressively into the loading zone right behind Chloe's shop. The hydraulic lift was already engaged, whining loudly as it hoisted the front tires of Chloe's custom-painted floral delivery van off the pavement. I quickened my pace, my heart giving a hard thump. Through the large glass windows of the boutique, I saw Chloe. She was standing on the sidewalk, wrapping her cardigan tightly around herself, her shoulders shaking. She was crying. A burly man in a high-visibility vest was standing next to the tow truck, holding a clipboard and looking completely unimpressed by her tears. I rushed forward, dropping the bakery box onto a nearby wrought iron bench. "Chloe, sweetheart, what is going on here?" I asked, wrapping a protective arm around her trembling shoulders. She looked up at me, her mascara slightly smudged beneath her eyes. "I do not understand," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "He says he is repossessing the van. He says we have missed 3 consecutive lease payments, but that is impossible. Julian handles all the business accounts. He set up the auto pay for the commercial vehicles months ago. There has to be some kind of terrible mistake. I turned my gaze to the man with the clipboard. He had the tired, cynical look of a guy who dealt with people's worst days for a living. I approached him, keeping my tone level but firm. "Excuse me, friend. I think there might be a clerical error here. My daughter owns this business. We can clear this up right now." The repo man did not even blink. "Look, buddy, I just get the work orders," he said, tapping his pen against the metal clip. "The leasing company issued the recovery order yesterday afternoon. 3 months delinquent. No response to the warning letters. The grace period is over. I am just here to collect the asset. You want to argue the numbers? Call the bank." I reached into my breast pocket for my checkbook. I was fully prepared to write a check right there on the hood of his truck to stop my daughter from crying. I had the money, and seeing her in distress was tearing at my heart. But before my hand even unbuttoned my coat, the screech of tires echoed down the street. Julian's leased sports car swerved into the loading zone, mounting the curb aggressively before slamming to a halt. He threw his door open and sprinted toward us. He did not look like the confident, arrogant venture capitalist who had sat in my living room 2 weeks ago. He looked like a man running for his life. His normally immaculate hair was disheveled, plastered to his forehead with a sheen of cold sweat. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and his eyes were wild with a frantic, desperate energy. "Hey, stop right there! Drop that vehicle immediately!" Julian shouted, waving his arms as he marched up to the repo man. "What the hell do you think you are doing? This is a massive banking error. You are stealing private property." The tow truck driver crossed his arms over his chest, looking at Julian with a mixture of boredom and contempt. "Save the performance, pal. The account is empty. The payments bounced. I am hooking the rear axle and pulling out of here in 2 minutes." Julian pulled a sleek smartphone from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it onto the concrete. He was dialing numbers with frantic, jerky motions. "Listen to me very closely," he growled, pacing back and forth in a tight, agitated circle. "My wealth management firm handles millions of dollars in liquid assets. My private bank flagged the auto draft as a fraudulent transaction because of a security update. It is a protective hold on the commercial account. That is all. I am transferring the funds from my personal portfolio right now." He shoved the phone against his ear, his jaw clamped so tight. The muscles twitched. I watched him closely, letting my protective father persona mask the cold, calculating observation happening behind my eyes. I watched the heavy bead of sweat trace down the side of his neck. I watched the erratic, trembling rhythm of his hands. I saw the way his expensive leather shoes shifted restlessly against the pavement. Chloe stepped forward, reaching out to touch his arm. "Julian, what is happening? Why would the bank freeze the account for 3 months without telling us?" Julian flinched away from her touch just for a fraction of a second, but I caught it. It was the physical reaction of a cornered animal. "Do not worry about it, Chloe," he snapped, his voice much sharper than the gentle tone he usually reserved for her. "I told you it is a technical glitch. The wire transfers got crossed between the offshore holding and the domestic branch. I am fixing it. Just let me work." He spent the next 10 minutes arguing furiously with someone on the phone. He paced down the alleyway, his voice hushed but frantic, making wild, pleading gestures with his free hand. Finally, he marched back to the repo man, shoving the phone into the driver's face. The driver listened for a moment, let out a loud, heavy sigh, and handed the phone back. "Fine," he muttered, looking at Julian with absolute disgust. "The agency just confirmed a manual wire transfer. You bought yourself 30 days, buddy. But if that wire bounces back, I am coming straight to your driveway next time." With a loud hiss of releasing pressure, the hydraulic lift lowered Chloe's delivery van back onto the pavement. The tow truck detached its heavy steel hooks and rattled away down the street, leaving a thick cloud of diesel exhaust in its wake. Chloe let out a massive breath, leaning against the side of her van. "Oh my God," she whispered, rubbing her temples. That was terrifying. "Julian, are you sure everything is okay with the business account?" Julian forced a laugh, running a trembling hand through his ruined hair. He pulled Chloe into a tight hug, kissing the top of her head. "Everything is perfectly fine, babe, I promise. Just a stupid clerical error at the bank. You know how these massive institutions operate. The algorithms flag a large transfer, and suddenly everything freezes. I will have my assistant yell at our account manager this afternoon. Chloe smiled, leaning into his chest, entirely comforted by his words. But as Julian looked over her shoulder, his eyes met mine. For one brief, unguarded second, the mask slipped completely. I did not see a wealthy investor looking back at me. I saw pure, unadulterated terror. He quickly plastered his fake, arrogant smile back onto his face and clapped his hands together. "Well, crisis averted," he declared, his voice pitching an octave too high. "Ronald, good to see you. Sorry for the morning drama. Just the trials and tribulations of high-level corporate banking, right?" "Right," I replied smoothly, picking up the bakery box from the bench and handing it to Chloe. High-level corporate banking. I hugged my daughter, kissed her cheek, and told her I would call her later. I walked back to my truck, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I did not start the engine immediately. I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Millionaire venture capitalists do not get their wives' delivery vans repossessed over a technical glitch. Men who manage vast portfolios of liquid assets do not shake uncontrollably while trying to wire a few hundred to a collections agency. They do not pace like desperate addicts in a back alley. They do not look at a tow truck driver with absolute, pants-wetting terror, as if their life is on the line. Julian Thorne was not experiencing a banking error. He was drowning. He was suffocating under a mountain of debt, scrambling to plug holes in a sinking ship. He had drained Chloe's commercial accounts dry, leaving her completely exposed, completely vulnerable, and totally unaware of the financial ruin creeping up on her. My gut feeling had evolved from a simple suspicion into a hard, undeniable fact. My son-in-law was a desperate, dangerous fraud, and he was currently bleeding my daughter's business to death to keep himself afloat. He needed a massive infusion of cash to save his own skin, which explained exactly why he was suddenly so interested in liquidating my industrial warehouse. He was hunting for a lifeline, and I was going to hand him an anvil. That Friday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Chloe on my porch with an overnight bag, looking exhausted. Julian stood behind her, gripping a duffel, wearing a strained smile. They claimed a plumbing issue flooded their master bathroom and ruined the carpets in their townhouse. The property management company, Julian explained, needed the weekend to run industrial dehumidifiers. It sounded like a reasonable inconvenience, but I knew better. Millionaires do not pack their bags and flee to their father-in-law's guest room over a burst pipe. They check into a hotel downtown and let their insurance foot the bill. I smiled warmly, stepping aside, offering them the guest suite. I knew exactly why they were here. The plumbing issue was a fabricated excuse. Julian was running out of time. His creditors were circling. The repossession agency was breathing down his neck, and he needed unfettered access to my home. Having him sleep under my roof felt like inviting a venomous snake into my bed, but I played the gracious host. I cooked dinner, poured him a glass of scotch, and listened to him boast about phantom investment portfolios. Chloe leaned against his shoulder, blind to the frantic desperation radiating from him. By 10, they excused themselves to bed. I waited until I heard the heavy oak door of the guest suite click shut. Then I retreated to my bedroom, leaving the door open just a crack. I did not sleep. I lay on top of my covers in the dark, fully clothed, listening to the ambient sounds of the house I had lived in for 3 decades. When you spend your life guarding scrapyards filled with valuable copper, you become a very light sleeper. You learn to differentiate between the harmless settling of a foundation and the deliberate footfalls of a trespasser. The house was silent for hours. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight, then 1. The neighborhood was dead to the world, and then at exactly 14 minutes past 2:18 in the morning, I heard it. It was a subtle, muffled groan of wood. The 4th floorboard in the upstairs hallway, right outside the guest suite, has a distinct squeak if you step squarely on its center. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and stood up, my bare feet silent against the carpet. I did not turn on any lights. I moved through the shadows of my home with the practiced ease of a man who knows every angle of his territory. I crept down the stairs, my breathing slow and measured. The downstairs hallway was bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight filtering through the high windows. I stopped at the bottom of the staircase, pressing my back against the cool plaster of the wall. Someone was moving around in my private study. The heavy mahogany door to the study was pushed open just a fraction of an inch. A thin beam of pale light sliced through the narrow gap, dancing across the hallway floor. I edged closer, leaning my head forward to peer through the crack. Julian was inside. He was dressed in dark sweatpants and a black t-shirt, holding a small pen light between his teeth. He was kneeling in front of my heavy fireproof filing cabinet, the one positioned directly beneath the framed photograph of Clara. He had bypassed the vintage steel safe in the corner. He must have realized during his first visit that he lacked the tools to crack a mechanical combination lock. Instead, he was focusing on the filing cabinet, utilizing a thin metal tension wrench and a lockpick to manipulate the simple cylinder lock holding the drawers shut. I watched him work. His breathing was heavy, ragged, echoing in the quiet room. His hands were shaking with a terrifying, unhinged urgency. He was not a professional thief. He was a desperate man backed into a corner, completely devoid of morals or boundaries. The lock gave way with a soft, metallic click. Julian practically ripped the bottom drawer open. He began tearing through the hanging folders, tossing aside utility bills, property deeds, and old tax returns. He was hunting for something specific. He wanted liquid numbers. He wanted to know exactly what I was worth and how quickly he could get his hands on it to pay off the monsters breathing down his neck. I let him search for another full minute, absorbing the sheer audacity of his betrayal. He was standing in the house my sweat had paid for, trying to steal the future I had secured for the woman sleeping upstairs. I stepped into the doorway, raised my hand, and firmly flicked the brass light switch on the wall. The study was instantly flooded with harsh, bright yellow light. Julian gasped, a sharp, terrified sound, and physically recoiled. He dropped the penlight onto the carpet and spun around, his eyes wide, his chest heaving. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice mild, almost groggy, as if I had just woken up from a deep slumber. "What on earth are you doing down here in the dark? Is everything all right with the guest room?" For 3 agonizing seconds, he stared at me, his mind clearly scrambling to process the situation and invent a plausible lie. Then the slick, manipulative con artist took over. He let out a breathless, forced chuckle and ran a hand through his hair, leaning casually against the filing cabinet to block my view of the open drawer behind his legs. "Ronald," he exhaled, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of exaggerated relief. "You scared the living daylights out of me. I am so sorry for sneaking around. I woke up with terrible heartburn. That spicy brisket we had for dinner really did a number on my stomach. I did not want to wake Chloe, so I came downstairs looking for the kitchen. I must have gotten turned around in the dark and wandered into your office. I was just trying to find a light switch." I smiled a gentle, accommodating smile that masked the absolute disgust boiling in my veins. "Of course, son," I said, my tone dripping with fake sympathy. "The kitchen is down the hall to the left. I keep a bottle of antacids in the pantry above the sink. Let me go grab them for you." I turned and walked to the kitchen, leaving him alone for just a few seconds. When I returned and handed him the chalky tablets, he thanked me profusely, wishing me a good night before hurrying back upstairs. I waited until his footsteps faded completely. Then I walked back into my study. He had closed the cabinet drawer, but in his blind panic, he made a careless mistake. I pulled the drawer open and looked inside. The folder detailing my total net worth and liquid cash reserves was pulled halfway up, sticking out awkwardly from the rest of the meticulously organized files. He had found exactly what he was looking for right there in the quiet house. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, casually flipping through the newspaper. Chloe came downstairs first, roughing the sleep from her eyes, and kissed my cheek. Julian followed shortly after, looking surprisingly refreshed for a man who had spent the early hours of the morning picking the lock on a filing cabinet. He greeted me with hollow enthusiasm, pouring cereal and chatting about the weather. I played the gracious host, offering a warm smile and asking if his heartburn had settled down. He assured me it had, completely oblivious to the hidden cameras that had captured every second of his midnight raid. The house was silent for hours. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight, then 1. The neighborhood was dead to the world, wrapped in a blanket of freezing Pittsburgh rain. I did not sleep. I lay on top of my covers in the dark, fully clothed, listening to the ambient sounds of the house I had lived in for 3 decades. When you spend your life guarding scrapyards filled with valuable copper, you become a very light sleeper. You learn to differentiate between the harmless settling of a foundation and the deliberate footfalls of a trespasser. And then, at exactly 14 minutes past 2 in the morning, I heard it. It was a subtle, muffled groan of wood. The 4th floorboard in the upstairs hallway right outside the guest suite has a distinct squeak if you step squarely on its center. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and stood up, my bare feet silent against the carpet. I did not turn on any lights. I moved through the shadows of my home with the practiced ease of a man who knows every angle of his territory. I crept down the stairs, my breathing slow and measured. The downstairs hallway was bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight filtering through the high windows. I stopped the bottom of the staircase, pressing my back against the cool plaster of the wall. Someone was moving around in my private study. The heavy mahogany door to the study was pushed open just a fraction of an inch. A thin beam of pale light sliced through the narrow gap, dancing across the hallway floor. I edged closer, leaning my head forward to peer through the crack. Julian was inside. He was dressed in dark sweatpants and a black t-shirt, holding a small penlight between his teeth. He was kneeling in front of my heavy, fireproof filing cabinet, the one positioned directly beneath the framed photograph of Clara. He had bypassed the vintage steel safe in the corner. He must have realized during his first visit that he lacked the tools to crack a mechanical combination lock. Instead, he was focusing on the filing cabinet, utilizing a thin metal tension wrench and a lockpick to manipulate the simple cylinder lock holding the drawers shut. I watched him work. His breathing was heavy, ragged, echoing in the quiet room. His hands were shaking with a terrifying, unhinged urgency. He was not a professional thief. He was a desperate man backed into a corner, completely devoid of morals or boundaries. The lock gave way with a soft, metallic click. Julian practically ripped the bottom drawer open. He began tearing through the hanging folders, tossing aside utility bills, property deeds, and old tax returns. He was hunting for something specific. He wanted liquid numbers. He wanted to know exactly what I was worth and how quickly he could get his hands on it to pay off the monsters breathing down his neck. I let him search for another full minute, absorbing the sheer audacity of his betrayal. He was standing in the house my sweat had paid for, trying to steal the future I had secured for the woman sleeping upstairs. I stepped into the doorway, raised my hand, and firmly flicked the brass light switch on the wall. The study was instantly flooded with harsh, bright yellow light. Julian gasped a sharp, terrified sound and physically recoiled. He dropped the penlight onto the carpet and spun around, his eyes wide, his chest heaving. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice mild, almost groggy, as if I had just woken up from a deep slumber. "What on earth are you doing down here in the dark? Is everything all right with the guest room?" For 3 agonizing seconds he stared at me, his mind clearly scrambling to process the situation and invent a plausible lie. Then the slick, manipulative con artist took over. He let out a breathless, forced chuckle and ran a hand through his hair, leaning casually against the filing cabinet to block my view of the open drawer behind his legs. "Ronald," he exhaled, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of exaggerated relief. "You scared the living daylights out of me. I am so sorry for sneaking around. I woke up with terrible heartburn. That spicy brisket we had for dinner really did a number on my stomach. I did not want to wake Chloe, so I came downstairs looking for the kitchen. I must have gotten turned around in the dark and wandered into your office. I was just trying to find a light switch." I smiled a gentle, accommodating smile that masked the absolute disgust boiling in my veins. "Of course, son," I said, my tone dripping with fake sympathy. "The kitchen is down the hall to the left. I keep a bottle of antacids in the pantry above the sink. Let me go grab them for you." I turned and walked to the kitchen, leaving him alone for just a few seconds. When I returned and handed him the chalky tablets, he thanked me profusely, wishing me a good night before hurrying back upstairs. I waited until his footsteps faded completely. Then I walked back into my study. He had closed the cabinet drawer, but in his blind panic, he made a careless mistake. I pulled the drawer open and looked inside. The folder detailing my total net worth and liquid cash reserves was pulled halfway up, sticking out awkwardly from the rest of the meticulously organized files. He had found exactly what he was looking for right there in the quiet house. This is a draft property transfer deed for Depot 42 that was submitted to the county recorder's office online 3 days ago. It was flagged and held because the electronic signature certificate did not match your registered legal profile. I stared at the document. It was a formal deed transferring ownership of the warehouse from Vance Industrial Salvage LLC to Thorn Wealth Management for a purchase price of $10. The signature at the bottom was mine. It was a clean, digital copy of my signature, but it had been authorized using Julian's corporate IP address. "He forged your signature, Ronald," Daniel said, his voice cold and steady. "He attempted to transfer your commercial property to his own shell company without your knowledge or consent. Under Pennsylvania Crimes Code, Title 18, Section 4101, this is forgery, a felony of the second degree, because it involves a deed and a document affecting legal relations. If he had succeeded, he would have sold the property to his developers and pocketed the cash, leaving you with nothing but tax liabilities." I looked at the forged signature, feeling a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. He actually thought I was so old and clueless that I would not notice my own property disappearing. "What is the next step, Daniel?" I asked. Daniel smiled, a sharp, predatory smile. "We have two distinct legal weapons here. First, the forgery under 18 Pascal CS 4101. That is a criminal offense. We can file a formal complaint with the district attorney's office immediately. The electronic tracking data is bulletproof. It points directly to Julian's computer. The second weapon is the divorce. Under Pennsylvania Consolidated Statutes, Title 23, Section 3502A10, during the equitable division of marital property, the court must consider the dissipation of marital assets by either party. Julian draining Chloe's boutique accounts and using her business funds to pay off his personal debts is a classic textbook case of dissipation. We can freeze all his personal and business accounts, file for an emergency injunction, and ensure that in the divorce, Chloe is awarded 100% of their joint assets, plus a judgment forcing Julian to repay every single dollar he stole from her flower shop. Because of the forgery, any contract or deed he tried to execute is void ab initio, completely invalid from the very beginning. He has no legal standing, no leverage, and no defense. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my knees. "I do not want to freeze his accounts yet, Daniel. If we trigger the legal alarms now, his loan sharks will panic. They will come after Chloe, or Julian will flee. I want the trap to close completely. I want him to walk into the warehouse himself." Daniel looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "You are playing a dangerous game, Ronald. Those loan sharks are violent men." "I know," I replied, my voice flat. "But they are also greedy, and greed makes men stupid. I want Julian to believe he has one last desperate chance to save himself. I want him to take the bait." Daniel syndicated my sentiment and nodded slowly. "All right, Ronald. We will prepare the paperwork, but we will hold off on filing until you give the word. But the moment he steps across that line, we crush him." I stood up and shook Daniel's hand. The legal framework was established. Now, it was time to set the trap. I returned to my study that afternoon and dialed Arthur Morales. "Arthur, I need you to make some changes to the security protocols at Depot 42, I said, staring at the vintage safe in the corner. "I want you to replace the standard padlocks on the outer gates with older rusted models. Make them look worn, but make sure they can be cut easily with standard bolt cutters. Next, I want you to pull all the perimeter guards back from the rear entrance. Leave a clear, unmonitored path from Gate 4 directly to the main loading dock. But keep the interior high-definition cameras active and make sure the silent feed is routed directly to my iPad." "Understood, Mr. Vance," Arthur replied. "What about the Federal Transport Company? Do I notify them?" "Yes," I said. "Contact their operations manager. Tell them we have a high security risk and we need to schedule a cash staging transport for Friday night. Tell them we will be storing a dummy cargo in the warehouse yard to act as a decoy. They will have their tactical response team on standby inside the main facility." Arthur did not ask any questions. He was a professional, and he knew that when I gave an order, I had a very specific reason for it. "It will be done, sir," he said, and hung up. I spent the rest of the evening preparing the safe. I unlocked the heavy steel door, spinning the dial through the combination. Inside, I placed the stacks of decoy cash, the single-dollar bills wrapped in $100 bands. Right on top of the cash, I laid the fabricated inventory manifest. I made sure the official-looking Vance Industrial Salvage letterhead was clearly visible. The document detailed a fictional shipment of 150 industrial platinum bars, valued at $15 million, currently stored in cargo container 12 at Depot 42. It noted that the shipment was being held under a private, unregistered customs bond and would be quietly liquidated to a foreign buyer on Saturday morning. I closed the safe door, but I did not spin the dial completely. I left the lock set so that a single turn of the dial would release the bolt. I wanted to make it as easy as possible for Julian. If he tried to open it, he would not need to spend hours guessing the combination. He would only need to give the dial a slight nudge, and the door would swing open. I wanted him to succeed. I wanted him to find the manifest. The next morning, Julian and Chloe came down to breakfast. Julian was trying to play the confident, relaxed husband, but the cracks were growing wider. He kept checking his phone under the table, his fingers tapping a frantic rhythm against his knee. His face was pale, and he had dark, heavy circles under his eyes. Chloe looked at him with quiet concern, but she did not say anything. She had spent the last 2 days trying to figure out why her flower shop accounts were empty, and Julian had spent those same 2 days feeding her lies about a banking audit. "Ronald, I was thinking about your proposal for Depot 42, Julian said, his voice slightly strained as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "Have you had a chance to read through the limited proxy documents? I would hate for you to lose out on this developer interest." I let out a soft, tired sigh, rubbing my temples. "I am still looking through it, Julian," I said, keeping my voice shaky and uncertain. "But my memory is not what it used to be. I spent last night looking for the original deeds in my study safe, but I got so confused by the numbers. I think I left the safe unlocked. I am just so tired these days." I saw the instant, predatory flash in Julian's eyes. He sat up a little straighter, his fork freezing mid-air. "You left the safe unlocked, Ronald?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Yes," I murmured, shaking my head. "I will have to look at it again tonight. I am just too overwhelmed right now." Julian smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry about it, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with false care. "You just relax. I will help you look through the papers later. You don't have to stress about a thing." That afternoon, I told Chloe and Julian I was heading out to the country club for a retirement dinner and would not be back until late. Julian was ecstatic, though he tried to hide it behind a polite nod. I walked out of the house, climbed into my truck, and drove straight to Daniel Gallagher's office. We sat in his conference room, monitoring the surveillance feed from my study on a large wall monitor. The house was empty except for Julian. Chloe had gone to her flower shop to try and deal with her suppliers. The screen showed the study. It was quiet, bathed in the soft afternoon light, and then at exactly 3:15 p.m., the study door opened. Julian walked in. He did not look like the confident professional venture capitalist. He looked like a frantic, desperate thief. He closed the door behind him and locked it. He did not even look at the filing cabinet this time. He marched straight to the vintage safe in the corner. He reached out and grabbed the heavy chrome handle. He gave the dial a quick, tentative turn. The lock gave way with a heavy metallic click. The safe door swung open. Julian gasped, a sharp, excited sound that carried clearly through the hidden microphone. He reached inside, his hands grabbing the stacks of cash. He ran his fingers over the green bills, his face lighting up with a greedy, manic joy. But then he saw the document. He pulled out the fabricated inventory manifest, his eyes scanning the official letterhead and the bold letters. 15 million platinum bars, Depot 42. He read the details of the custom bond, his jaw dropping. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice shaking. 15 million. In an abandoned warehouse, he quickly pulled out his phone, took several high-resolution photographs of the document, and stuffed the paper back into the safe. He closed the heavy steel door, spun the combination dial to lock it, and hurried out of the room. He did not touch the decoy cash. He was not looking for a few $1,000s anymore. He had just found the ultimate prize. He had found the thing that would not only pay off his debt to the loan sharks, but would make him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. On the monitor, Daniel Gallagher turned to look at me, a grim expression on his face. "He took the bait, Ronald," Daniel said. "He has the photographs. He thinks there is $15 million in platinum waiting to be stolen in an abandoned warehouse. What is his next move?" I asked. Daniel leaned back, tapping his pen against the table. "He is going to contact his lenders. He is going to tell them he has a way to pay them back, but he needs their help to rob the warehouse. He cannot do it alone. He will bring them with him to do the heavy lifting." I nodded, my face hardening. That is exactly what I want. I want them all in one place. I want the loan sharks and the son-in-law caught red-handed inside a federal staging facility. I want the federal government to handle the prosecution. Daniel picked up his phone. "I will contact the Federal Transport Company's security director," he said. "We will coordinate the staging. We will make sure the warehouse is fully prepped with their tactical team by Friday night. The trap is ready, Ronald. We just have to wait for the rat to bite." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. The storm was coming, and I was going to make sure Julian Thorne was standing right in the center of it when the lightning struck. On Friday morning, the air was cold and damp in Pittsburgh. The forecast called for heavy rain. Starting in the evening, a perfect cover for a robbery. Julian spent the day in a state of high, nervous energy. He paced around the house, talking in hushed whispers on his phone, and barely touched his breakfast. Chloe watched him with growing anxiety. She had spent the last 24 hours receiving warning letters from her suppliers, and she was starting to realize that her business was on the verge of collapse. She had tried to talk to Julian, but he had brushed her off, telling her he had a major deal closing that night that would solve all their problems. "Ronald, I have to go out tonight for a late-night meeting with some international investors," Julian said during dinner, his voice tight and erratic. "It is a massive opportunity, and it could secure our financial future permanently. I might be out quite late." I smiled, a warm, supportive father-in-law smile. "Of course, Julian," I said. "Business never sleeps, does it? You do what you have to do. Just be careful in the rain." Julian nodded, his hand shaking slightly as he picked up his glass of water. "I will, Ronald. Thank you." Chloe looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but she did not say a word. She looked exhausted, her spirit completely broken by the stress and the lies. After dinner, I waited until Julian went upstairs to pack his things. I walked into the living room, sat next to Chloe on the sofa, and took her hand. It was cold, trembling, just like her mother's used to when she was worried. "Chloe, sweetheart, I want you to come with me tonight," I said softly. "I want to show you something." She looked at me, her brow furrowed. "What is it, Dad? I am so tired, and Julian is—" "I know about Julian, Chloe," I interrupted gently, my voice filled with a quiet, unyielding strength. "I know about the business accounts, I know about the loan sharks, and I know what he is planning tonight." She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. "What? Dad, how do you know?" "He told me it was just a banking error. He told me everything was fine." "It is not fine, Chloe," I said, pulling the folder of financial records from my briefcase and placing it in her lap. "He has drained your boutique accounts. He has stolen over $150,000 of your money to pay off his gambling and bad investment debts. And he has forged my signature on a property deed to try and steal my warehouse." She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the bank statements and the forged deed. The color drained from her face, and she let out a small, strangled gasp. "Oh my God," she whispered, covering her mouth as the tears began to pour down her cheeks. He did this? He stole from me? He lied to me?" "Yes, sweetheart," I said, wrapping my arms around her. "He is a fraud, and he was planning to leave you to deal with the debt while he ran away. But I am not going to let him ruin you. Tonight, I am going to show you the truth. I want you to see exactly who you married, so that you can walk away from him forever without a single regret." She cried quietly against my shoulder for a long time, the pain and the betrayal finally washing over her. But as she cried, I felt the familiar, cold strength returning to my chest. I had made a promise to Clara, and I was going to keep it. I was going to protect our daughter, and I was going to absolutely destroy the man who tried to use her against me. By 10:30 p.m., the rain was coming down in sheets, beating violently against the windows. I saw Julian sneak down the stairs, dressed in dark clothes, holding his leather bag. He slipped out the back door and climbed into his sports car, his headlights cutting through the darkness as he drove away. I turned to Chloe, who was standing beside me, her face pale but her eyes clear and focused. "Let's go, Chloe," I said. "It is time to watch the show." We walked out to my truck, the cold rain soaking our jackets. Chloe sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her face a mask of quiet determination. She was no longer crying. The soft, gentle girl I had protected for so long was beginning to show the steel she had inherited from her mother. She was ready to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I started the engine, and we pulled out of the driveway, following the taillights of Julian's sports car into the dark, rain-swept streets of Pittsburgh. I knew that by the time this night was over, Julian's fake world would be completely shattered, and Chloe would be free. The drive to the industrial district was long and quiet, the windshield wipers sweeping away the freezing rain in a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. I kept my headlights low, making sure I did not spook Julian. I wanted him to arrive at the depot thinking he was completely unmonitored. I wanted him to walk into the trap with absolute confidence. The board was set, and the pieces were moving exactly where I wanted them to go. Driving through the storm, the rain drummed a heavy, unrelenting beat against the metal hood of my utility truck. I watched Julian's sleek, black sports car weave through the traffic ahead of us. It was a vehicle designed for speed and vanity, built to show off on clean, dry streets, but in this downpour, it looked unstable, slipping slightly on the wet asphalt as Julian drove too fast, his anxiety clearly directing his foot on the gas. My truck, on the other hand, was heavy, solid, and built for utility. It held the road with an unyielding grip, a reflection of the difference between us. Julian was all show, a shiny exterior with no traction, while I was built to endure. I glanced at Chloe, who was looking out the window, her jaw set, her face illuminated by the green glow of the dashboard lights. She was quiet, but I could tell she was preparing herself. She was a Vance, and when a Vance faces a storm, they do not hide. They look it in the eye. We drove through the pouring rain, the city lights reflecting off the slick black pavement of the Pittsburgh streets. I drove my old, reliable utility truck, keeping a safe distance behind Julian's sports car. Chloe sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. She did not say a word. The silence in the cab was heavy, filled with the grinding sweep of the windshield wipers. We pulled into a dark, abandoned alleyway across the street from Depot 42. The industrial district was completely dead at this hour, a wasteland of rusted sheet metal, cracked concrete, and overgrown weeds. The warehouse stood in the darkness, a massive, imposing shadow against the gray sky. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my iPad. I opened the surveillance app, bringing up the high-definition night vision feeds from the depot. On the screen, the outer gate was visible, secured by a heavy iron chain. I tapped the screen to show Chloe. "Look," I said. "Julian is already there." On the monitor, we watched Julian's sports car pull up to Gate 4. He got out of the vehicle, holding the pair of heavy iron bolt cutters. The rain was plastering his hair to his forehead, his face pale and contorted with desperate greed. Two other men stepped out of a dark SUV parked behind him. They were large, burly men, dressed in dark tactical gear, with the distinct glint of handguns tucked into their waistbands. Julian approached the gate, positioning the bolt cutters on the rusted lock. He struggled for a moment, his body straining against the metal, before the lock snapped with a loud, metallic crack. He pushed the gate open, waving the two armed men forward. They moved quickly, slipping through the opening and heading toward the main loading dock. Chloe watched the screen, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Dad, those men, they have guns," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Julian brought armed men to rob your warehouse." "Yes, Chloe," I said, my voice dead calm. "He brought armed loan sharks to steal what he thought was $15 million in platinum. He was willing to commit a major federal felony, to bring violent criminals into our lives just to save his own skin. He did not care about you, he did not care about the business, and he did not care about the consequences. He wanted the money." We watched the screen as Julian and the two men approached the main loading dock. Julian used the bolt cutters to snap the second lock on the heavy rolling steel door. He pushed the door up, the metallic rattle echoing in the quiet night. The three men stepped inside the warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior of the warehouse looked empty, a vast cavern of concrete and steel, with a single, large cargo container sitting in the center of the floor. "Container 12, Julian whispered, his voice carrying through the surveillance microphone. "It is right here." He ran toward the container, his hands shaking as he examined the heavy digital lock on the steel door. He pulled out his phone, looking at the photographs of the fake manifest he had taken from my safe. The passcode was printed at the bottom of the inventory sheet. He entered the numbers on the keypad, his face lighting up with a greedy, manic joy. The digital lock clicked, the heavy steel door swinging open. Julian stepped inside, his flashlight beam dancing across the interior, but he did not find $15 million in platinum bars. The container was completely empty, except for a single, large digital clock mounted on the back wall. The red numbers were counting down. Julian stood frozen, his flashlight beam fixed on the flashing red numbers. The two enforcers behind him stepped into the container, their handguns drawn, their eyes scanning the empty steel walls in confusion. "What the hell is this, Thorne?" One of the men growled, his voice rough and angry. "Where is the metal?" Julian could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The countdown timer hit 0, and the silent warehouse erupted in a blinding flash. High-intensity stadium floodlights, secretly mounted along the steel rafters, snapped on all at once, bathing the entire loading dock in a glaring white light that cut through the darkness like a knife. A deafening, high-pitched security siren began to wail, its mechanical shriek echoing off the concrete walls and vibrating through the floorboards. Julian dropped his smartphone to the concrete, raising his arms to shield his eyes from the blinding glare. The two hardened loan sharks behind him instinctively raised their handguns, their tactical training kicking in as they desperately searched for targets in the chaotic light. But their criminal experience also allowed them to immediately recognize the terrifying reality of their situation. This was not an abandoned scrapyard. They had walked blindly into a highly fortified federal stronghold. The trap had closed on them, and there was no way out. Inside the metal container, the air was hot and suffocating, thick with the smell of old paint and rusted iron. Julian's flashlight beam was shaking so violently that it cast erratic shadows against the steel walls, making the empty space look even more hollow. The two loan sharks were breathing heavily, their faces dark with a mixture of confusion and rising fury. "What the hell is going on, Thorne?" The larger one barked, stepping toward Julian, his hand gripping the butt of his gun. "Where is the metal? You said there was 15 million in platinum bars stored right here." Julian's voice was a high, terrified squeak as he backed away. I don't know," he stammered, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at the digital clock. The passcode was right. The manifest said Container 12. "It has to be here." The timer continued its relentless countdown, the bright red numbers ticking away the final seconds of his freedom. Heavy steel tactical doors swung open on all sides of the warehouse yard. Dozens of highly trained, heavily armored federal guards poured out into the glaring light. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute military precision, forming a tight, inescapable perimeter around the three intruders. They did not carry standard sidearms. They carried high-powered, short-barreled assault rifles, and every single weapon was raised and locked firmly onto their targets. A booming, amplified voice echoed through a heavy loudspeaker, cutting cleanly through the wailing siren. "Federal armored transport. Drop your weapons immediately or you will be shot. Do it now." The loan sharks were violent men, but they were not suicidal. They instantly realized they were vastly outgunned and hopelessly outmaneuvered by federal authorities. Without a single moment of hesitation, they dropped their handguns. The weapons clattered loudly against the concrete. They interlaced their fingers behind their heads and slowly dropped to their knees, their faces tight with fear. They knew the penalty for threatening federal transport guards was a guaranteed, long-term stay in a maximum security prison. Julian, however, completely unraveled. The polished, manipulative venture capitalists simply ceased to exist. The man who had callously planned to drain his wife's accounts and leave her to deal with violent loan sharks was instantly reduced to a pathetic, terrified shell. He dropped the heavy bolt cutters, the tool clattering against the pavement. He did not simply kneel. His legs gave out completely. He collapsed onto the cold, hard ground, falling directly into a shallow puddle of muddy water. Dozens of glowing red laser sights instantly tracked across his chest, dancing wildly over the lapels of his expensive designer suit. He threw his hands into the air, his body shaking with violent tremors. He began to cry. It was not a quiet, dignified surrender. It was a loud, hysterical, and embarrassing wail of absolute terror. Through the high-definition audio feed on my iPad, Chloe and I could hear him frantically begging for his life, screaming that it was all a terrible mistake, that he was just a businessman looking for his father-in-law. The federal guards ignored his pathetic pleas. 4 heavily armored officers moved in rapidly, kicking Julian flat onto his stomach in the mud. They wrenched his arms violently behind his back, securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. I watched the dark, spreading stain forming on the front of his tailored trousers. In the face of actual, immediate consequence, Julian Ornthorne had lost complete control of his bodily functions. He had literally wet himself in the mud, crying like a frightened child, while federal agents stripped him of his freedom. I turned slightly to look at my daughter. Chloe was staring intently at the iPad screen, completely mesmerized by the pathetic, humiliating spectacle unfolding on the concrete. There was no pity left in her eyes. There was no lingering trace of love or affection for the man begging in the mud. The calculated illusion he had so carefully maintained for 2 years was permanently, irreparably shattered. She was finally seeing the miserable, cowardly reality of the man who had promised to cherish her forever. Chloe slowly reached over and closed the protective cover of the iPad, shutting off the video feed. She let out a long, heavy breath, releasing the immense burden she had been unknowingly carrying for years. She looked at me, her face illuminated by the distant glow of the warehouse floodlights. Her eyes were now completely clear. The nightmare was over. We sat in the truck in silence, the rain drumming against the metal cab. I started the engine and slowly backed out of the alleyway. I looked at Chloe, and she gave me a small, tired nod. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly. "Thank you for showing me." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "I will always protect you, sweetheart," I said. We drove home, leaving Julian and his thugs in the custody of the federal agents. The trap had worked perfectly, and my daughter was finally safe. The federal staging facility was designed with a level of security that went far beyond standard commercial requirements. When my company had originally leased the land and facility to the Government Transport Division back in 2018, we had signed a strict non-disclosure agreement regarding the building's internal systems. The walls were reinforced with 4-inch steel plates behind the concrete. The glass was ballistic grade, and the entire perimeter was monitored by a military-grade satellite uplink. Julian and his loan sharks had no idea they had walked into a fortress. On the surveillance screen, I could see the panic starting to set in. Julian's breathing was shallow and frantic, his chest heaving as he stared at the countdown. The 2 thugs behind him were swearing under their breath, their fingers tightening on the grips of their handguns, their eyes darting to the heavy steel doors that were slowly sliding shut behind them. They were trapped like rats, and they were finally starting to realize it. The wailing of the siren was deafening, a high-pitched scream that seemed to vibrate the very air in the warehouse yard. Julian took a step backward, his boots slipping in the mud, his face white as a sheet. He looked at the empty cargo container, then at the wailing clock, and let out a soft, whimpering sound of absolute despair. He had spent months planning this robbery, believing he was the smartest man in the room, and now he was looking at the end of his freedom. The morning sun cast a long, pale golden light across the polished granite countertops of my kitchen. The house was profoundly quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic, terrifying symphony of federal sirens and screaming loan sharks that had dominated the previous night. I stood by the coffee maker, listening to the rhythmic, comforting drip of the dark liquid filling the glass carafe. Chloe sat silently at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped tightly around a warm ceramic mug. She was pale and visibly exhausted, but the agonizing tension that had gripped her shoulders for 2 long years was completely gone. The devastating illusion of her perfect marriage had been brutally ripped away, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity. We had not spoken much since returning from the industrial district. There was no need for grand speeches or emotional declarations. She had witnessed the absolute truth with her own 2 eyes, and that truth had irrevocably severed the toxic chains Julian had wrapped around her life. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, savoring the bitter, earthy aroma, and turned to face my daughter. I was just about to ask her what she wanted for breakfast when her mobile phone shattered the peaceful silence. The device vibrated aggressively against the solid granite, the harsh electronic ringtone echoing sharply in the quiet kitchen. Chloe flinched slightly, her eyes darting to the glowing screen. She stared at the unknown, out-of-state number flashing relentlessly. A sudden, deep apprehension clouded her features. She slowly reached out and pressed the green button, sliding her thumb across the glass to answer the call. She placed the phone on speaker, laying it flat on the counter between us. A cold, automated, and entirely emotionless voice filled the room. "This is a collect call from the county correctional facility. An inmate has requested to speak with you. If you wish to accept the charges, press 1 now." Chloe looked up at me, her eyes wide and searching. I gave her a single, firm nod. She pressed the number 1 on her keypad. The automated voice clicked off immediately, replaced by the frantic, echoing sounds of a crowded holding block. And then we heard Julian. "Chloe, please tell me you are there." His voice was a high, pathetic, and agonizingly desperate whine. He was sobbing uncontrollably, his words tripping over each other in a rushed, terrified frenzy. "You have to listen to me. There has been a massive, terrible misunderstanding. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was just driving past your father's old warehouse, and these armed men jumped out of nowhere. The police arrested me by mistake. They have me locked in a cell with violent criminals. Chloe, it is terrifying in here. You have to call my lawyer right now. You have to drain the business accounts and post my bail immediately. They are talking about federal charges, but it is all a complete lie. You have to get me out of here today." I listened to the pathetic, sniveling coward pouring his fabricated lies through the speaker. Even now, trapped behind solid steel bars and facing decades of incarceration, he was still attempting to manipulate his wife. He was still desperately trying to use her as a convenient shield to escape the devastating consequences of his own boundless greed. He had spent the previous night casually plotting to hand her over to ruthless loan sharks, and now he was begging her to empty her struggling flower shop accounts to purchase his freedom. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his narcissism was almost breathtaking. I watched Chloe carefully. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but her expression did not soften with pity. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, undeniable revulsion. She opened her mouth to reply, to unleash the righteous fury she had every right to express, but I gently placed my hand over hers. I shook my head slowly. This was not her burden to carry anymore. The final execution belonged entirely to me. I picked up the phone from the granite counter, lifting it to my ear. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, unwavering resolve settle completely into my voice. "Hello, Julian," I said. My tone as flat and unforgiving as a slab of solid concrete. The frantic, pathetic sobbing on the other end of the line ceased instantly. The federal tactical officers moved with a level of speed and efficiency that was terrifying to behold. They were members of a specialized rapid response division trained to defend federal cash staging hubs from armed attacks. They wore heavy, matte black ballistic armor, Kevlar helmets with integrated night vision goggles, and carried short-barreled tactical assault rifles equipped with high-intensity laser sights. Every move they made was synchronized, a flawless demonstration of military logistics. They formed a tight, multi-layered perimeter around the 3 men in the yard, blocking every possible avenue of escape. The loan sharks, who had spent their lives intimidating local business owners and running street-level scams, looked completely paralyzed. They had never faced a force like this. They knew that if they raised their weapons, they would be cut down in a fraction of a second. The red laser sights danced across their chests, a silent and deadly warning. Julian was shaking so violently he could barely keep his hands in the air. He tried to speak, to explain that he was a venture capitalist, but his voice was drowned out by the wailing siren and the booming commands of the tactical commander. He was looking at a wall of black armor and steel, and he knew his life was over. The silence that followed was so profound, I could practically hear Julian's racing heartbeat through the digital connection. When he finally spoke, his voice was nothing more than a terrified, trembling whisper, the realization striking him with the force of a physical blow. "Where is Chloe? Why do you have her phone?" "I want to speak to my wife immediately." "Chloe is sitting right beside me," I replied calmly, taking a slow sip of my hot coffee, "and she has absolutely nothing to say to you. She is completely finished listening to your endless, pathetic lies." We had a very illuminating evening together, Julian. We took a lovely, scenic drive down to the industrial district. We parked in a dark alleyway across from a certain dilapidated building, and we watched a highly entertaining show unfold on my security feed. We watched you confidently attempt to break into a federal transport hub, and we watched you cry like a terrified child when the tactical guards put you face down in the mud. There was a sharp, strangled intake of breath from the other side of the line. "You were there?" Julian choked out, his voice thick with rising panic. "You set me up. You faked that entire inventory manifest. You deliberately led me straight into a trap." "I did not set you up, Julian," I corrected smoothly, feeling a deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest. "I simply presented you with a beautifully crafted mirror, and you eagerly showed me the monstrous reflection of your own bottomless greed. You wanted to steal my legacy. You wanted to sacrifice my daughter to violent criminals just to secure your own cowardly escape. You wanted my warehouse, son. You got it. But you did not break into a clueless old man's abandoned scrapyard. You did not find $15 million in unregistered platinum waiting to be stolen. You broke directly into a highly classified federal cash staging facility. You coordinated an armed assault on a United States banking transport stronghold. The men you brought with you were carrying illegal, unregistered firearms. You triggered a Level 4 federal security response." "Ronald, please," Julian begged, his voice completely shattering into high hysterical sobs. "You have to tell them the absolute truth. You have to help me now." I laughed, a low, cold sound holding absolutely no trace of humor. "I am not going to help you, Julian," I stated firmly. "Enjoy your 25-year federal sentence without parole. You are a ghost to us." Julian screamed in absolute despair, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly as I pressed the red button, ending the call. I set the phone down and permanently blocked the number. The bright morning sun was shining perfectly through the window. The nightmare was truly over, and our entire family was finally safe and completely free. Exactly one entire month after that unforgettable night, the oppressive clouds that had choked our family finally parted. Julian was sitting in a cold isolation cell inside a maximum security federal detention center, awaiting a highly publicized federal trial. The ruthless syndicate loan sharks he had brazenly attempted to double-cross were indicted right alongside him. A federal judge had taken one look at the overwhelming mountain of evidence and immediately denied Julian any possibility of bail, officially declaring him an extreme flight risk. He was going absolutely nowhere. He would eventually trade his tailored designer suits for a bright orange jumpsuit, and the man who once believed he was untouchable would soon become nothing more than a forgotten prisoner serving a devastating sentence. On a remarkably beautiful Thursday morning, I drove my daughter into the bustling heart of the city. Chloe sat comfortably in the passenger seat of my heavy utility truck. Her complexion was completely restored, her posture radiated a quiet, undeniable strength, and the dark, heavy circles under her beautiful eyes had entirely vanished. The divorce proceedings were already moving forward with an incredible swiftness, surgically excising Julian from her life permanently. We parked outside a towering glass structure and rode a silent elevator directly to the prestigious top floor. Daniel Gallagher, my most trusted corporate attorney and a fierce loyalist to my family, was waiting patiently for us inside his expansive corner office. Chloe took a seat in a plush leather armchair, casting a curious, questioning glance in my direction. I walked slowly across the expensive carpet and sat directly beside her. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. I opened it and placed a single heavy brass key squarely onto the polished mahogany desk between us. The physical collapse of Julian was a pathetic sight. He lay face down in the freezing mud, his $3,000 designer suit ruined, the dark water soaking through his trousers and shirt. He was sobbing hysterically, his voice cracking as he begged the guards for mercy. The rain was coming down in sheets, plastering his disheveled hair to his forehead and washing the dirt across his face. One of the tactical officers placed a heavy combat-booted foot squarely on the small of Julian's back, pinning him to the ground, while another officer pulled his arms behind him, securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs that clicked shut with a cold finality. The loan sharks were treated with equal efficiency, their weapons kicked aside, their wrists bound with heavy plastic zip ties. They sat in the mud, their heads bowed, their faces dark with anger and defeat. I watched the surveillance screen, my face showing no emotion, but inside I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. Chloe sat beside me, her eyes fixed on the screen, watching the man she had loved grovel in the dirt. The illusion was gone, replaced by the pathetic reality of a cornered thief. She reached out and tapped the screen to close the feed, letting out a long, slow breath. The weight of his lies had finally been lifted from her shoulders, and she was free. Chloe stared at the ornate key, completely bewildered. She asked what it was for, her voice echoing softly in the quiet room. I smiled warmly, reaching out to gently cover her hand with mine. I told her that a man who spends his entire life building a massive empire from jagged scrap metal learns to hide his most precious treasures where absolutely no one will ever look. I explained that Julian had foolishly believed my wealth was locked away inside a rusted warehouse or sitting exposed in vulnerable personal bank accounts. But Julian was a remarkably superficial creature who never understood the profound depths of a father's protective instincts. I nodded toward Daniel, who handed Chloe a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I told her to open it. Her trembling fingers turned the crisp, heavy pages. She stared at the complex legal documents, struggling to process the massive figures printed in bold black ink. I explained that years ago, shortly before her mother passed away, we had quietly established an impenetrable blind trust exclusively in her name. The real wealth, the massive culmination of my life's hardest work, was completely legally insulated. It was protected by layers of ironclad corporate law and was entirely untouchable by any greedy, manipulative spouses. The brass key unlocked a private vault containing the physical bearer bonds and certified asset deeds that belonged solely to her. Julian had spent 2 years hunting for a hidden fortune that he literally never had the legal clearance to touch. Tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude spilled freely down Chloe's cheeks. She stood up abruptly, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck, burying her face into my shoulder. I held her close, feeling the incredible, undeniable bond between a father and his beloved daughter restored completely. She thanked me endlessly, but I told her that protecting her was the greatest privilege of my entire life. Later that week, Chloe officially reopened her floral boutique. With the heavy, suffocating anchor of Julian's secret financial drain permanently removed, the business began to flourish immediately. She hired 2 new assistants to manage the overflowing customer orders, and her vibrant, joyous laughter echoed through the fragrant, colorful shop once again. She was finally reclaiming her independence. That Sunday evening, I sat alone on the sturdy wooden porch of my quiet house. The late afternoon sun hung low on the distant horizon, casting a warm, brilliant golden glow across the manicured green lawn. I held a crystal glass filled with rich amber bourbon. The air was incredibly peaceful, devoid of the chaotic tension that had previously poisoned our lives. I took a slow sip of the smooth, burning liquid, letting the comforting warmth spread deep into my chest. I looked up at the vast, beautiful expanse of the painted sky, feeling Clara's presence settling softly over me. I smiled, raising my glass in a silent, solemn toast. "I kept my promise, Clara," I whispered to the gentle wind, my voice thick with unshakable conviction. "Nobody takes what is ours. Greed is a blinding poison, making arrogant men believe they are smarter than everyone else. When you exploit the pure love of a family to line your pockets, you inevitably build your own inescapable cage. True wealth is not found in secret warehouses, stolen accounts, or fabricated lies. It is forged through decades of honest sweat, fierce loyalty, and the unwavering instinct of a father defending his own. Never underestimate a quiet man who spent his entire life building a massive empire from simple scrap. He knows exactly how to dispose of the trash that threatens his beloved family. If this story proved that karma always comes to collect, smash that like button. Have you ever had to deal with a toxic partner or a greedy person trying to ruin your family? Share your experiences in the comments below, and please subscribe for more incredibly powerful daily life stories. That was the end of the script, but the lessons of the salvage yards lingered in my mind. You learn early on that rust never sleeps, but it can always be scraped away. You just have to be willing to get your hands dirty. We spent the next 3 weeks finalizing the divorce terms. Julian tried to fight it from his cell, using a public defender to argue that the assets in the blind trust should be considered marital property. He claimed that because the trust was funded during their marriage, he was entitled to a 50% share of the equity. It was his final desperate attempt to secure a payout. The drive back to the suburbs was quiet, the only sound being the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. Chloe sat in the passenger seat, her head resting against the glass, looking out at the rain-slicked streets of Pittsburgh. When we arrived home, the house was completely still, a sanctuary of warmth and peace after the cold chaos of the industrial yard. I went to the kitchen and brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, the rich, earthy aroma filling the room. Chloe sat at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, staring into the dark liquid. We sat in silence for a long time, letting the reality of the night settle around us. It was a clean silence, free of the tension that had poisoned our home for the last 3 months. I looked at my daughter, seeing the quiet strength returning to her features. She looked so much like Clara in that moment, the same calm resolve, the same quiet dignity. We talked about her mother, replaying old memories of the early days in the salvage yards when we had nothing but a rusted truck and a dream. Chloe smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. She was beginning to heal, and I knew that the foundation Clara and I had built for her would hold her steady through whatever came next. But Daniel Gallagher was more than prepared for him. In the county court, Daniel presented the certified bank audits showing that the blind trust was established in 2014, a full 4 years before Julian had even met Chloe. He also presented the electronic tracking logs proving Julian had forged my signature on the Depot 42 transfer deed. Under Pennsylvania Crimes Code 18 Pascal CS 4101, a contract executed through forgery is void ab initio. It has no legal validity, and no party can claim any rights or benefits from it. Furthermore, under 23 Pascal CS Graph 3502A10, Daniel presented the detailed accounting of the boutique's commercial account. The records prove Julian had systematically drained the $152,400 from Chloe's business to cover his personal debts to unregulated lenders. This was a clear, undeniable case of dissipation of marital assets. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for financial predators, did not hesitate. In her final ruling, she denied Julian's claim to any portion of the family assets, declared the deed transfer void, and ordered him to pay full restitution of $152,400 to Chloe's business. The judge also awarded Chloe sole ownership of their townhouse and their joint savings, leaving Julian with nothing but his debts and his upcoming criminal trial. The victory was absolute. Julian Thorne was left exposed, a bankrupt felon sitting in a federal cell, while Chloe was free. The restoration of her boutique was a joy to watch. I spent my Saturdays helping her set up new display shelving in the shop, working with the cedar and pine she loved. We worked in silence, the smell of fresh sawdust filling the room, just like the old days with Clara. Chloe had reclaimed her life, her business, and her confidence. She was no longer the quiet, passive wife. She was a successful business owner who had stood up to a predator and won. And as I sat on my porch on Sunday evenings, drinking my bourbon and looking at the sunset, I knew that the promise I had made to Clara was fulfilled. The salvage empire had done its job. It had protected our family, and the trash had been disposed of permanently. The federal prosecutors finalized Julian's plea agreement 2 months later. facing a minimum of 20 years for conspiracy to commit armed robbery of a federal transport hub, forgery under 18 Pascals CS 4101, and federal securities fraud. Julian chose to plead guilty. He was sentenced to 18 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. His loan sharks received 22 years each. The news of their sentencing was a small paragraph in the local paper, a quiet end to a noisy career of greed. I folded the paper and threw it into the fireplace, watching the flames consume the names of the men who had tried to take what was ours. The fire burned bright and clean, leaving nothing but ash. I took a final sip of my bourbon and smiled. The salvage yards had taught me well. When you find a piece of junk, you don't try to polish it. You just melt it down and start over, and that is exactly what we did. Our family is safe, our legacy is secure, and the future is ours to build. Thank you for listening to my story. The lessons of life are hard, but they are durable. And when you build on a solid foundation, nothing can tear it down. The federal charges against Julian were massive. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, conspiracy to commit armed robbery of a federal cash staging facility carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years, escalating to 25 years or life if firearms are involved. The federal prosecutor, a stern man named Harrison Miller, made it clear that they were not interested in a plea deal that did not involve significant prison time. Because Julian had coordinated the robbery, provided the codes, and brought armed enforcers, he was considered the primary organizer of the conspiracy. The court denied his application for bail, declaring him a flight risk and a danger to the community, and he was remanded to a federal holding block. When he called Chloe from the facility, he was a broken man. He tried to claim he was a victim, that the loan sharks had forced him to do it, but the recordings from the study cameras and the depot surveillance proved otherwise. The audio captured him explaining the manifest, inputting the codes, and laughing about how easy it would be to rob the warehouse. The evidence was absolute, and he had no defense. He was facing the full, unyielding weight of the federal justice system, and there was no way out. The courtroom was a cold, formal room with high windows that let in the gray Pittsburgh light. Julian sat at the defense table, dressed in a faded green jail jumpsuit, his wrists secured by a chain around his waist. He looked smaller, his expensive suits and groomed hair replaced by the uniform of a prisoner. The public defender stood beside him, trying to argue that the blind trust was a marital asset, but his arguments were weak and formal. Daniel Gallagher stood at our table, presenting the Delaware trust deeds and the bank statements with a quiet, devastating confidence. I watched Julian's face as the judge read her final ruling. When she declared the deed transfer void ab initio and ordered him to pay full restitution of $152,400 to Chloe's business, his head dropped onto the table. He was a man who had built his entire life on appearance, and now he was looking at the absolute, legal reality of his own ruin. After the legal dust had settled, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the nature of families and the silent battles we fight to protect them. The city of Pittsburgh, with its towering bridges and winding rivers, had seen its share of rise and fall, much like the salvage yards that had given me my start. I realized that my work was not just about processing steel or reclaiming metal. It was about understanding structural integrity. When a beam is loaded beyond its capacity, it doesn't always break immediately. It bends. It groans. It gives you warning signs. Julian Thorne had been a structural defect in our family from the very beginning. His slick words, his expensive wardrobe, and his constant need for validation were the microfractures in the foundation. I had seen them. Clara had seen them in her memory, and we had prepared for the eventual collapse. I remember the conversations I used to have with Clara in our old kitchen. She would sit at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea, and say, "Ronald, you build things to last, but you also have to build them to withstand the storms." Chloe is a gentle soul. She sees the good in everyone, even when it's not there. We have to be her strength. I had taken those words to heart. The blind trust, the corporate structures, the layers of security. They were not just financial decisions. They were the braces and the supports we had built around our daughter's life long before the storm ever arrived. Chloe was starting to understand that now. She would come over to my house on Sunday afternoons, and we would sit on the porch together, not talking about the trial or the debts, but about the flowers she was preparing for the upcoming spring season. She had a new project, a design contract for a historic hotel downtown, and her eyes would light up as she described the arrangements she was planning. I watched her, feeling a quiet pride. She was no longer the trembling girl standing on the sidewalk watching her van get repossessed. She was a Vance. She had the steel in her spine, the same resilience that had kept Clara and me going through the lean years. The salvage yard business had been sold off to a larger industrial conglomerate, but I kept the land under Depot 42. It was a reminder. I would walk through the empty warehouse sometimes, the dust motes dancing in the light filtering through the high windows, and listen to the silence. It was no longer a place of conflict. It was a monument to a promise kept. The local newspapers had stopped writing about Julian Thorne. He had become just another number in the federal system, a quiet warning to other slick financial operators who thought they could outsmart the people who actually built the city. I liked it that way. The best victories are the quiet ones, the ones that don't need a headline. We had survived, our family was safe, and the legacy Clara and I had built was securely in Chloe's hands. The brass key I had given her was a symbol of that security, a token of a father's love that would protect her long after I was gone. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, the amber liquid warm against the evening chill, and looked out over the lawn. The trees Clara and I had planted years ago were tall and strong, their roots deep in the soil, holding the earth together. That was the real meaning of a family. Not the money, not the warehouses, but the deep, invisible roots that hold you steady when the wind blows hard. And as the stars began to appear in the clear night sky, I knew that we had built something that would last. The foundation was solid and the structure was secure. The storm had passed and the quiet had returned. And that was all I ever wanted. The blind trust that Clara and I had established in 2014 was a masterpiece of corporate asset protection. I had worked with Daniel Gallagher for months to structure it, ensuring that all our personal wealth, corporate shares, and property deeds were held under a private, legally insulated trust directory. The trust was governed by a strict fiduciary mandate. The assets belonged exclusively to Chloe, and no spouse, creditor, or derivative entity could ever lay claim to them. Daniel had registered the trust in Delaware, utilizing layers of LLCs and corporate holding structures to make it completely invisible to public asset searches. Julian had spent 2 years searching for my wealth, looking through county tax records and auditing my salvage yard holdings, but he had never even scratched the surface of our actual net worth. He had been hunting for a shadow, while the real fortune sat protected behind an impenetrable wall of corporate law. Chloe turned the pages of the trust portfolio, her eyes wide as she saw the bearer bonds, the treasury certificates, and the deeds to our properties. She looked at me, tears of gratitude filling her eyes. "Dad, you and Mom did all of this?" she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. "We built it to last." The vault at Richmond Federal Savings was located in the basement, behind a massive 10-ton steel door that had been cast in the 1970s. The room was silent, the air cool and smelling of old paper and polished brass. I had rented Box 482 with Clara in 1995, shortly after we had secured our first major demolition contract. I remember the way Clara had smiled when the vault manager turned the 2 keys to slide the metal box out. We did not have bearer bonds or corporate deeds back then. We just had our original incorporation papers and a small envelope containing our first profits. Clara had squeezed my hand and whispered, "Ronald, this is where we keep our future safe." 30 years later, I stood in that same room with our daughter, watching her turn the brass key. It was a bridge across time, a continuation of the promise I had made to the woman who had helped me build everything. Looking back, I realized that the salvage business teaches you a lot about human nature. You see the things people discard, the old machinery, the rusted pipes, the broken structures, and you learn to look past the surface decay to find the quality of the metal underneath. You learn that some things are worth saving, while others are just junk, only fit to be melted down. Julian Thorne had been junk. He was a cheap alloy, shiny on the outside but brittle and hollow at the core. He had tried to treat my daughter's love as a scrap asset to be traded away, but he had ended up getting crushed by the very machinery he tried to exploit. Chloe had learned that lesson too, though the cost had been high. She had seen the raw reality of greed, and it had made her stronger, more discerning, and more independent. She no longer looked for validation in the eyes of others. She found it in the quality of her work and the strength of her own character. The floral boutique was thriving, a fragrant, colorful haven in the heart of the city, and she was managing it with a confidence that reminded me daily of Clara. She had taken the lessons of the scrapyards and applied them to her own life, learning how to clear away the waste and build on a solid foundation. Daniel Gallagher remained our steady guardian, his legal expertise ensuring that Julian's appeals were dismissed and his debts were permanently isolated. The townhouse had been sold, the proceeds used to fully restore Chloe's business reserves, and she had moved into a beautiful, quiet cottage near the park, a place that was entirely her own. We would have dinner there once a week, sitting in her small garden surrounded by the blooms she had cultivated. It was a peaceful life, the kind of quiet comfort Clara and I had always hoped she would have. And as I sat on my porch on this Friday evening, the sunset painting the hills of Pittsburgh in shades of deep red and gold, I felt a profound sense of completeness. I had lived a hard life, filled with sweat, dirt, and heavy labor, but it had been a good life. I had built an empire from scrap, but my greatest achievement was sitting in that cottage near the park, safe, happy, and free. I raised my glass to the fading light, a silent toast, to the woman who had shared the journey with me, and to the promise that had been kept. We had cleared away the rust, scraped away the decay, and what remained was solid, clean, and built to last. The salvage yards were gone, but the foundation remained, and on that foundation we had built a future that nothing could destroy. The wind blew soft and cool through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh leaves. I took a final sip of my bourbon and closed my eyes, letting the quiet settle deep into my bones. I was Ronald Vance, 58 years old, a retired scrap metal merchant, a father and a protector. I had done my job. I had protected my family, and the trash had been disposed of, permanently. The fire in the hearth was dying down, the glowing coals casting a warm, comforting light across the study walls. I stood up, walked over to the desk, and turned off the surveillance iPad. The screens went dark, the silent feeds no longer needed. The warehouse was quiet, the city was quiet, and my home was quiet. And that was the best sound of all. True wealth is not found in secret warehouses, stolen accounts, or fabricated lies. It is forged through decades of honest sweat, fierce loyalty, and the unwavering instinct of a father defending his own. Never underestimate a quiet man who spent his entire life building a massive empire from simple scrap. He knows exactly how to dispose of the trash that threatens his beloved family. Thank you for listening to my story. The final resolution of the case brought a profound peace to our lives. Chloe's floral boutique in the historic district was thriving, the fragrance of fresh roses, lilies, and eucalyptus filling the air, attracting new clients from all over the city. She had hired 2 new design assistants, and the sound of her laughter was once again a constant presence in the shop. She was independent, successful, and completely free of the parasite that had tried to drain her life. On Sunday evenings, I would sit on the porch of my quiet house, holding a crystal glass of rich amber bourbon. The late afternoon sun would paint the hills of Pittsburgh in shades of gold and deep red, the air cool and peaceful. I would look up at the vast expanse of the sky and raise my glass in a silent, solemn toast to Clara. I kept my promise, Clara, I would whisper to the gentle wind. Nobody takes what is ours. We had cleared away the rust, scraped away the decay, and what remained was solid, clean, and built to last. The salvage yards were gone, but the foundation remained, and on that foundation we had built a future that nothing could destroy. Our family was safe, our legacy was secure, and the quiet had returned. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, the rich, smoky flavor warm against the cool evening air. The sunset had faded now, leaving a deep blue twilight over the hills of the city. I could hear the distant, quiet hum of the Pittsburgh streets, a comforting reminder of the world carrying on. The house was peaceful, the quiet no longer a heavy, empty silence, but a warm, reassuring presence. I looked at the dark windows of my study, knowing that the vintage safe was locked and the feeds were dark. The work was done. The salvage yards had been my life, a long journey of sweat and steel, but they had served their purpose. They had given us the strength to protect our own, and they had given me the tools to scrape away the rust that had threatened my family. I closed my eyes and let the quiet wind wash over me, feeling a deep, unyielding satisfaction. We were safe, we were free, and the foundation was solid.